Well, good afternoon and welcome to another edition of Cultural Markisms with Mark Powell. And this is a special episode of The Good Sauce because I have with me a special guest this afternoon, Dr. Stuart Piggin. Dr. Piggin is, I think, one of the leading intellectuals and historians in Australia, and he's written a magnificent 2-volume work recently on the history of evangelicalism, in particular in Australia. So good afternoon. Welcome, Stuart. It's great to have you with us.
Marvelous to be with you, Mark. Thank you.
Stuart, for those of you in the audience that might not be familiar with you, your career, your work, can you give us a very quick sketch, a very quick summary of your academic career?
I did a PhD in King's College London in the early 1970s on 550 missionaries who went to India. And so that introduced me really to evangelicalism, because most of the missionaries who went to India were evangelicals. Indeed, most of the missionaries in Australia have been evangelicals. And then I received an appointment to the University of Wollongong. I was appointed in English social history. And when I got there, the professor said to me, "What do you really want to teach?" And I said, "Well, I thought I was appointed to teach English social history." He said, "Yes, but what do you really want to teach?" And I said, "Well, I'd love to teach religious history." And he said, "Well, go to, young man." Just like that in the just like that in the secular university. Things have changed since then, of course. But it meant that for 16 years I was able to teach in the University of Wollongong courses on religion and society and courses on the Reformation, things like that. It was a marvellous time. Those courses became the second most supported courses in the University of Wollongong, just behind Australian history in general. I think because actually church history, religious history, Christian history is a lot more interesting than people think, because it's closer to everybody in their concerns. I've noticed that the church is very close to people in times of need, extremity. The church is there, and the church is actually closer to people than governments. And so religious history, in a way, is more relevant to people, even though they might not imagine it, than political history.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
I was appointed Master of Robert Menzies College at Macquarie University and established the Centre for the Study of Australian Christianity. I moved from English religious history and American religious history to Australian religious history because for the bicentenary in 1988, I was offered a large research grant to do research on Australian Christianity. And that again is unusual in the secular university these days. But I did get this large grant, and so that's what started off the Evangelical History Association and the work which 30 years later led to the publication of these 2 volumes on the history of Australian evangelicalism. But you see, Mark, it's had a very long time in coming. But in answering your question about my academic career and its relation to universities in Australia in general, this is a very interesting and important issue that it goes back to 1928, actually, to 1828, when in the University of London they decided to have a university which did not teach religion, did not have any Christianity involved. It was the first secular university in Britain. Before that, as you know, Oxford and Cambridge were mainly concerned with preparing ministers for their profession.
And you had to actually subscribe to the 39 articles, didn't you, to study there?
Yeah, indeed. You couldn't get a degree, you couldn't qualify, you couldn't graduate until you'd signed the 39 articles. Anyway, so the University of London in 1828 went down this track of having a secular university without teaching anything to do with Christianity. And in the first universities in Australia, in Sydney and Melbourne, they followed the London lead. And so what that meant was that the study of theology, the study of Christian history was not permitted in the university at first. And this has been a very significant decision on the part of governments and universities, because it's meant that Christianity has never been studied. It hasn't traditionally in Australia hasn't been studied at the highest levels, and people think there is some, that Christianity and religion are somehow secondary things to study. In actual fact, Christianity is a very complex thing to study, and requires all the brain power that anyone's got and more.
Yeah.
So that's been a bit of a sad development. And what that means, I think, is that nowadays, with the university, as you know, becoming more and more secular, and now declaring war not only on Christianity but on the humanities in general. I mean, it was the great author James Coetzee who said that there's a connection between post-Christianity and post-humanities and post-literature. He said it's almost as if people have been born out of a recent egg. They've got no background. So people shouldn't imagine that just by declaring war on Christianity, that you're not also declaring war on lots of other things which are very essential and precious in the understanding of Australian society. Well, that's a long answer to your question.
It's fascinating, and there's so many things to talk to you about this afternoon. I remember, before we get to your book, which I really want to get to, because I think this is one of the most important publications that we've seen in a generation. And in fact, congratulations, I should say, because your book, The Fountain of Public Prosperity, has won Christianity's Book of the Year for 2019. And then the second volume has just been released as well, which is the last 100 years from 1914 to 2014. So congratulations on that. It's a superb work. I think it's a real game changer for Australian scholarship, because it fills a real lack, particularly in what you've just talked about. So congratulations. It's a fantastic work.
Thank you, Mark.
I remember you saying once that when we look at charities across Australia, most of them, and I think you mentioned something like, I think, is it 27, 28 major charities in Australia, the majority of them are Christian. Can you explain a little bit about that and how that's developed in our Australian history?
Yes. Like most things in Australian history, there's got a long period of development, and Christianity is essential in that development. One of the things that we discovered when we began our research, we were quite surprised to discover this, that in any relatively small community in Australia, from about the 1830s on, it became customary to build 4 churches: Anglican, Catholic, Methodist, and Presbyterian. This was because of the church. This was because of Governor Burke and the Church Acts. Historians have misunderstood all this, I think. What they have said is, well, that explains why you have denominations in Australia arguing with each other. That's what sectarianism is all about. But we argue in our book that what that really means is that Australians were given a large number of Christian options, and huge access to Christian ministry. Because even in these small communities, you had not one church as you had typically in a community in Britain, but you had these 4 different Christian communities. In actual fact, what they did most of the time, of course, they're all learning from each other. They were competing with each other. We don't think it was sectarian rivalry. We call it holy emulation, or sanctified competition. Because this really meant that the Christian cause in Australia was greatly helped by this. Now, this is important because it means that the great majority of the Australian population in the 19th century was thoroughly Christianised, and I think Australia became one of the most Christianised nations on earth. Yeah,
I read that. That's fascinating.
Yeah, I think it's an important thing, particularly in terms of values. So when it comes to get back to your question about charities, for example, when it comes to charities, it means that Australians had already imbibed the Christian value of care or love, faith, hope, and love. And these are sort of central, not only Christian values, but they're now central Australian values. And it means that Christians are the sort of people who typically in a community are the most altruistic. I mean, they've made studies of the social capital, which are generated by people who go to church, and people who go to church generate a lot more social capital than people who don't go to church. People who go to church become far more involved in community organisations, and therefore in Australia you had this extraordinary phenomenon which is more remarkable than in Britain or even in the United States, which was meant to be a more religious country than we are.
Yeah.
These the great majority of charities in terms of income are Christian. And then you also get the interesting recent development in recent decades of the Christian schooling system, which means now that about a third of Australians are educated in non-government schools, and most of those schools are Christian schools. So that too is very interesting. And then a lot of the welfare that's being done in Australia is done by Christian organisations. So there is a much bigger engagement of Christianity in Australian social welfare, in Australian social life, than is understood. Our secular historians have not understood that very well. By downplaying the importance of Christianity, they've left that important fact out. People have missed it.
Just on that, if I could just read to you a section from your book. This is from volume 1, and published by Monash University Press. You make the comment that in a survey of the profession of historians taken in 1987, close to the date of the conception of the present study, 48% of the respondents, of the 124 respondents, said that they were atheists. A further 12% said that they were agnostics. And this is in the study of history. So how much has our understanding of us as a nation been affected by actually the personal beliefs of historians? Or should I say the personal unbelief of historians?
Yes. Well, that is the tail end, as it were, of that development in the 1850s, when the universities were founded, when they kept Christianity out. It meant that most historians, me included, we were trained mainly in Marxist methodology. And I suppose in the University of Sydney, where I went, there were very important exceptions, because some of those historians were trained in Britain. And so we were actually given a very good education in church history, even in the University of Sydney in those days. But the great majority of Australian historians, as you see from those statistics, identified with agnosticism or with atheism. And we also remarked there that that was way out of kilter in the 1980s, when that survey was taken, with the rest of the Australian community, when it was about 2% who identified with agnosticism or atheism. So that means that the history profession is out of kilter with the rest of Australian society. And that's why so much needs to be done in order to redress that. These books that we were talking about this afternoon, Mark, are very revisionist, in the sense that they seek to come up with a radically new interpretation of Australian history, putting the Christianity back in because it's been left out.
Well, when you say revisionist, though, one of the things I've really appreciated about your work, and I mean, if people can see the thickness of these two volumes here, these are major works. I think in total there's 600 pages in the first volume, another 600 so pages in the second. It's not just the volume, though. It's, I think, the breadth of scholarship that you've done. So when you say revisionist, what I found the most refreshing was the amount of secondary literature and primary sources that you quote. If I could just give one example, early on in volume 1, you talk about the example of William Dawes, who seemed to be a man of sincere evangelical faith. And yet the true revisionist history has happened as people have reinterpreted his character or his persona as everything but Christian. Can you explain a little bit about that, and give maybe our listeners a bit of a pot shot of how different people have approached the figure of William Dawes? Yes.
There have been many studies made now of Dawes because he's such a fascinating person. And people who are not Christians cannot ignore the fact that he's fascinating. But I think because they're trained in sort of Marxist thinking, they don't look for the real motivation behind these people. You see, we're interested in what motivates people. What is it that makes people do the things that they do and believe the things that they believe? Historians typically don't do that because they are interested in bigger statistics and trends and all those sorts it's things. It means that history become very boring, actually, because most people want to know what motivates people. Christianity makes it far more interesting by insisting that we look for what motivates people. Well, in the case of Dawes, I think there are half a dozen historians have written about Dawes, and one of them, Gibson, makes it in a wonderful book. I certainly don't downplay the importance of the book. He gives 26 or 27 interpretations of Dawes, but not one of them has anything to do with Christianity. Dawes was very much involved in the early evangelical movement. I mean, one of the things that illustrates is that one of the things we need to revise about Australian history is the understanding of our origins, because again, the Christianity has been left out of that. But the evangelical movement was very important in the settlement of Australia, not only in the appointment of Richard Johnson, the first chaplain, but even in the First Fleet. We talk about how the First Fleet, contrary to what is said typically in the stereotypes, is that the First Fleet was a callous disaster. In actual fact, it was an incredible maritime success. Not many people died at all, and the convicts, when they got off the ships, were in a better health, certainly fatter than when they got on, because they were so well provisioned. And they were so well provisioned because they were provisioned by evangelicals who were determined that this would be nothing like the slave trade, because they had then begun to abolish the slave trade.
Again, so that was another fascinating. That was a fascinating insight in your book, where you talked about, well, what was the motivation for the settling of Australia? Can you talk about the different views that historians have had, and the view that you and Robert Linders are presenting as a very fresh approach to based on the primary sources?
Yes, well, when we went to school, we were taught, weren't we, that Australia was settled because of the American Revolution, and the American Revolution meant that England could no longer send its convicts to America; had to find somewhere else to send it. And of course, that there's a validity in that. Others have argued that we were after we wanted to set up a worldwide empire. Others have argued, to counteract the French and the Spanish, and then later the Russians. And then others have argued that it's all about commerce. We're looking for flax industry and things like that. But we came up with a fourth reason for settling Australia, and that was the fact that evangelicals were heading at that time towards the formation of the major missionary societies, which all happened in a big rush in the next decade. And they were getting very interested in converting people in the Pacific. And so Australia they wanted to settle Australia as a base to take the gospel to the people of the Pacific Islands. They also believed that Australia probably had about, the calculation of one of the geographical gazetteers was that Australia had about 8 to 12 million people. And, that was very attractive to Christians who wanted to get out there and convert souls. So this was a major motive on the part of those who supported Richard Johnson and the sending of the first chaplain to New South Wales, namely that a base would be laid, small at first, but nevertheless a secure base for the sending of the gospel all over the southern world.
And can I just say, I don't think I've ever told you this, but my own background is as a Kanaka from the Solomon Islands, where John Patton, the great Presbyterian missionary, brought the gospel to the New Hebrides and Vanuatu and the surrounding islands. So my own ancestry is a product of that very evangelical vision from 200 years ago. So it's incredible to see it come full circle.
Yes, John Patton, great man, and and obviously he's created a dynasty of great evangelical pastors ever since, the Presbyterian denomination especially.
Hey everyone, don't forget to tune in tomorrow night for the weekly wrap-up with Karina Ocatel. Some of the best stories of the week. It'll be unmissable viewing, a great recap of the week in case you've missed anything. That's tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. I'll see you then. Yeah, well, again, another thing I really appreciated about your 2-volume work was the ecumenical breadth that you brought to it. So, you focus on key evangelical figures within Anglicanism, within Presbyterianism, within Methodism, even the Baptists. It's a fascinating sweep of research. In fact, I was sort of stood in awe as I finished the first volume, thinking, the breadth of reading that you've done for this is immense. You must have felt exhausted afterwards.
Well, it's not only the breadth of reading, but it's a different way of understanding the way Christianity is engaged in the world. You see, if you study it from a narrow denominational point of view, if you say, I will study only the Presbyterians, or I'll study only the Methodists, or I'll study only the Anglicans, or only the Catholics, only the Baptists, and you talk about one of those after another, then it sort of reads like a telephone directory. And it's not always terribly riveting. But if you ask yourself the question, well, what did all these people have in common? What was the driving force that they all had? And you'll find that what we call in the book common Christianity was a vital factor in early Australian history, because the early Australian Christians believed that the thing that really mattered was the gospel. It was bringing salvation to people, bringing the news of the gospel to people, and they all had that in common. They had different emphases, which meant that when you put the whole movement together, all these things added up to something very significant. So the Methodists, for example, were always very strong on social action. They never forgot Wesley's legacy of commitment to the poor. Presbyterians were always faithful to theological purity and reformed thought, and they brought that to bear. The Anglicans in the present generations have followed the Presbyterians in that way as well, but they have had a bigger establishment connection, because there have been more of them in Australia coming from Britain than the Scots Presbyterians.
Can I just ask you a question on that, Stuart? Because
interaction with government, which is very important.
Yeah, I'd like to get
one of the things, if I could say, Mark, one of the things I could just say, one of the very important findings of our book, I think, which is probably going to stir people up a bit, that most of us, even Christians, have come to believe in the importance of the separation of church and state. But in Australian history, that has been a minority experience. In Australia, for most of the time, from about 1788 with the First Fleet up till about 1870 with the Education Acts, there was what we call a sort of a plural establishment, because the government was supporting all these different denominations in the interests of nation building. It was a plural establishment. It wasn't a separation of church and state. There was integration, interdependence of church and state. And then that went on, I think, until about the 1960s, the separation of the two, because of the lack of state aid for education and so on, free secular education. From 1870 to 1960, you do get the separation of church and state, which is fairly valid. But from then on, when the government has come back in again and wants to assist the churches, and certainly with the involvement of government and churches in welfare and in education and in health, you get this incredible interdependence of church and state. What we noticed in the 19th century, the previous century, was that a lot of governors of the various colonies were very involved with the churches, trying to help the churches to make their contribution to the development of the nation. I mean, we have this idea that the state is hostile to the church because the earliest governor, Philip, wasn't particularly sympathetic. He had an Enlightenment view, and he was followed by another Gross who was anti-Christian. But from then on, most of the governors of New South Wales have been incredibly supportive, even coming up to the present day. There's been this incredible support of governors with churches. So I think that's a sort of understanding of Christianity in Australia that we don't normally have. We think the importance of the separation of the two, but in actual fact, there's an interdependence of the two. And if that's true, then we need to work out how to make that work, how you have engagement between church and politics. And in the 20th century, it became popular for politicians to hide their Christian commitment. But in the 21st century, and in the first century, even the first decade of this century, with John Howard and Kevin Rudd nailing their Christian commitment to the mast, Christianity and politics became intertwined in a way they hadn't been before.
Well, just on that, we've seen that come full flower in Scott Morrison, haven't we, as the first Pentecostal Prime Minister? I'd love to hear your thoughts on why you think there's been a rise in the charismatic and Pentecostal churches within Australia, particularly in, say, the last 50 years.
Yes. Again, this has long and deep roots, Mark. I think that Pentecostalism, my way of understanding it, is that it is an evolution, a development out of Methodism and the holiness movement of the 19th century. The emphasis on experience, and evangelical Christianity has always valued the importance of experience. Evangelical Christianity is biblical experientialism. That says the Bible is the only and main source, but our experience of the reality of Christ is very important, because it's very important for Christianity to be vital Christianity. It's got to be real, and it's got to be real in our experience, and therefore experience was something which they stressed. Well, Pentecostalism, as you know, is very strong on experience, and I think probably when the emphasis came on doctrine to the point where it became a very scholastic and intellectual enterprise, that was a form of talking about Christianity that not everybody in Australian society could easily follow and identify with. I think Pentecostals have therefore identified that there's a great need for Christians not to forget the dimension of experience, and not to forget the experience of revival, because evangelicalism was born of revival in the 1740s. That's why in our first volume we start 1740. We don't start in 1788, start in 1740. You've got to take it back to that. But experience is very important. And but when Christians lose sight of experience, and something's got to come along to replace it. And I think Pentecostals did that. We actually tell the story in the second volume of how in the 1970s, the Sydney Anglicans, who are conservative evangelicals, made a study of Pentecostalism because so many of their members were becoming interested in it. And they decided at the synod level that this was not for them. This was in the 1970s. And this was exactly at the time when the Pentecostal churches, which had been around in Australia since the first decade of the 20th century, but they just hadn't been very strong. But in the 1970s, the Pentecostal churches decided that they would get on side with the charismatic movement. And the charismatic movement and the Pentecostal churches were not the same thing at first. The charismatic movement came from the mainline churches. It was experience of the experience in the mainline churches, and the charismatics infiltrated the Pentecostals, or took over the Pentecostals. And the Pentecostals from then on stopped talking about the things which we normally associate with Pentecostalism so much, like tongues and healing and things like that. That was not the most important thing. The most important thing was to have dynamic leadership. And so from that time on, the Pentecostal churches have taken off like a rocket because they've been well led. All of which leads me, Mark, to this rather optimistic conclusion, because in the second volume we talk about how the three main branches of evangelicalism, the Pentecostals, the conservative evangelicals, and the progressive evangelicals, how they have all made a similar discovery, namely that in order to really work in Australian society, you have to be Christ-centred, you've got to be Bible-based, and you've got to be socially connected, which means you've got to be well-led. You've got to understand how the Bible engages with culture and society. For that, you need leadership. But if you've got those three ingredients, Christ-centeredness, Bible-based, and well-led, then there's no reason why a church community in Australia, in spite of secularisation, should not thrive and grow.
Yeah, thank you. It's a great insight. Can I step back a little bit and get you to reflect on your own career in the university? You made a number of intriguing points earlier on, that you were trained, I guess, in Marxism or Marxist ideology. I know some leading even Christian intellectuals today would say, bah, humbug. There's no such thing as cultural Marxism. That's a right-wing conspiracy theory. Can you just sort of reflect, how much do you think cultural Marxism is at play within the university system? Is it accurate to say that?
It's a very complex question. I think that in the 60s and 70s, pure Marxism was adhered to by many people. I think before the discrediting of the Soviet Union and the eventual fall of communism, there were a disproportionate number of academics who identified with that left-wing communistic perspective. I don't mean to say that all the Marxists were communists, and indeed communism in Australia has never been a movement which has attracted a lot of adherents. I think probably in a big church in Australia and on a Sunday, you might have had more people. You might have had more people going to it than attended than were members of the Communist Party, even in the 1930s. I don't know about that, but I think it's probably right. But then, in recent decades, what has happened, I think, is that you do have this not this pure ideological Marxism, but this sort of cultural Marxism, which has become identified with all sorts of other isms. And including the deconstructionism and the view that you can't have such a thing as an objective reality and all that sort of stuff. Mm-hmm. But I think that together they are playing havoc with the humanities, because they really are very destructive and very unhelpful and very boring. And after a while, people just get sick of it all, and they want to study people. They want to they want to have stories. They want to know what makes people tick. So the way of writing history has got to be changed in order to get away from that movement which is killing off the humanities.
I mean, your book's been so successful. I was talking actually to the publisher of Monash University Press at your first book launch, and which was at Scott's Church in the city, a very famous church because you've got John Dunmore Lang with his back to the church, facing in the other direction, because he did have his problems with the church over the years. But what was fascinating is that's where your book was launched, and I remember talking to the publisher there, and he just was looking around the room marveling at the interest in your book. And I said, yeah, look, there's an untapped market here that you're just not seeing. And he said, I know, I can see it now. Do you think, does that give you heart and encouragement to see more evangelical Christians publishing in the academic sphere?
It does and it doesn't. I mean, I think that Monash University Press they were incredibly good to me. They were marvellous to work with. And the publisher that you're talking about, Nathan Hollier, he really seemed to get what it was about, even though he was not a professing Christian. He said at the launch, remember, that it would please his grandmother that he's come to church for the first time in decades or something like that. So he's not a committed Christian, but he seemed to understand what the argument of the book was. He got it, and so on the cover of the book and so on, he has distilled what it's all about, and that's impressive. But when I tried to get it published by University of New South Wales Press, for example, they just said, "Oh, we wouldn't be able to sell this book."
What a missed opportunity!
Well, exactly. The fact it's outsold most Australian history books, because most Australian history books only sell about 300 copies. That's a normal run for an Australian history book.
How many have yours sold to date?
Well, this is the first volume before the coronavirus had sold 2,000. So that's way in excess of the normal. Anyway, so I don't know if publishers get it yet. They themselves, of course, like everybody else in Australian society, have been secularised. They think that Christianity is yesterday's news. It's over the hill. People are leaving churches. They won't buy books. And so, yes, they're not with it.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing that
I think it's great if we can try to get published by non-Christian publishers. But
I mean, I've met a few scholars, evangelical scholars, like people Dr. Stephen Shavera, formerly of Macquarie University. I think he's working on a work right now on Robert Menzies, a great Presbyterian once again. But it's fascinating to see too, I think, the surprise from the world at how good evangelical scholarship is as well. Do you find that is also underplayed in the academic sphere, the contribution that Christians make academically?
There are certainly a lot of academics who are in positions of power who are negative about Christian history and who are negative about religion. They are secular bigots. They don't understand the importance of religion in human history. And because they have the power and because they're brought up in Marxism, they believe that if you have the power, you exercise it. And so it is very hard for a Christian, particularly nowadays, to get a position in a university, so that some of the best historical scholars, because they're Christians, they don't get a run.
Stuart, just on that, what would you say to young men and women coming through the tertiary education system now that have an interest in history? Is there a future in the humanities, particularly in history, and especially for evangelicals? Do you see any promising career prospects for them?
Well, I think that all historians now would be anxious about the future because humanities is in trouble. So one might hesitate to recommend to anybody that they should get involved in this industry. But I think that probably a better view is that it's very important to maintain the Christian presence, and it's very important to keep the humanities, and therefore it's better to keep up the struggle, realizing in advance that it's not going to be plain sailing. You're going to suffer a lot. You're going to be discriminated against, particularly if you nail your colours to the mast. I mean, Christian academics normally have two views towards this. There are those who say, well, in academe, I'm going to keep the fact that I'm a Christian completely under wraps. I'm not going to let anybody know about that. And there are others of us who say, well, we want to talk about the things that really matter, and therefore it's important to reveal who we are and to be open about our Christianity. But if you take the latter course, you've got to accept that there will be those who will not take kindly to that and who will discriminate against you. That's certainly been my experience. I've been discriminated against on a couple of occasions, which really have affected me in academe. But I've also had great opportunities, as I mentioned earlier, and so I think that it's good to trust in the Lord and to get involved. What our two books are about, I think, about the value for Australia of Christian engagement in the society. You've got to be engaged. You cannot withdraw and become a holy huddle.
Yeah.
You've really got to understand the culture. And even when it comes to the understanding of the Bible, for example, which is so essential to evangelicals, I think we should agree with Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who said, "He who understands only the Bible knows nothing of it," because you've got to apply the Bible. You've got to apply the Bible to the context and culture in which you live. One historian was saying to me just the other day, look, we can't get ministers to read history. We can't get them to read church history or any other type of history. They all say they're so busy. And I think that might be right. But insofar as they don't think that the study of history, the study of their own religious movement within its Australian context is important, then that is very sad, because it means that they're not able to apply the Bible and the gospel in a way that they could if they did understand their history. that history is a discipline of context, and therefore it's essential to understand our context in order to understand how the Bible, how the gospel should be applied in any situation.
Yeah, look, wise words, because I mean, as a minister myself of the gospel in the Presbyterian Church, I found your book so refreshing. It helped me to see my own context with fresh eyes, as I saw really the great cloud of witnesses that had gone before me, and how particularly I think what I was challenged and encouraged, even inspired by, was how about exactly the public engagement of evangelicals in the past. And I think that's something I think we've lost. It's almost like we need to recover the Protestant work ethic that all things are done to the glory of God. Whereas I think we've become a little bit too, dare I say, narrow in our focus as evangelicals today.
Yes, there's good reasons for it, I think. I think that, you see, the thing about engagement is that it's risky, and people make mistakes, and people suffer as a result. And therefore, a lot of people then say, well, it's too hard. We'll just withdraw and get into our own little holy huddle and keep it that way. But if you believe in engagement, then it is astonishing the extent to which committed evangelical Christians have been engaged in the most extreme parts of Australian society. In our book, for example, we talk about how Bob Menzies was a Bible reading. He read these scriptures every day before he went to bed, read the Sermon on the Mount and all the rest of it regularly. But he also got stuck into a communist who happened to be a Church of Christ minister. And you get Christians who are on the extreme left, particularly those who have been influenced by liberal Methodism and so on. And you get Christians on the extreme right and everything in between. And I think because if you're not identifying with one of the extremes, you wish that people wouldn't get involved in those things. But I think you have to take the risk. You've got to take the risk that you're being called by God to engage with a community for a particular purpose, and you just do your thing as well as you can, as you've said, to the glory of God. And it'll lead you in the most amazing paths. In the book, we also talk about how the major speeches which have been made in Australia on two of the biggest contemporary issues in Australia, namely multiculturalism and Aboriginal reconciliation. The speech which Al Grasby made in the 70s on multiculturalism, introducing the word to Australia, that was written by an evangelical Christian from the Evangelical Union in Sydney, Jim Houston.
Right.
And the speech that Rudd gave for Aboriginal reconciliation was actually written by an evangelical Christian who was the captain of Trinity Grammar School.
Oh.
Yeah.
Oh, I did not know that.
Well,
wow.
Well, you've got to finish reading the whole second volume to get to that, Mark.
I did read it. I just missed that point. I should have seen that because my own sons go to Trinity Grammar School.
Okay.
Yeah, it's a little bit too far away from Scots College, unfortunately, which is a very, very good college as well. So thank you so much for your time. Again, I'd highly recommend these two volumes by Stuart and Robert Linders. The Fountain of Public The Fountain of Public Prosperity and Attending to the National Soul. This is volume 1, and this is volume 2. Well recommended. I think essential reading, especially if you're in any form of ministry, like Stuart has said. Fascinating insight to get into our own setting as we look with fresh eyes. So again, thank you very much to Dr. Stuart Piggin for joining us. It's been great having you on the show, a wealth of insight, and I look forward to maybe having you on the show again sometime. And next time I hope to talk about Jonathan Edwards, which I know is another great love of yours.
Yes, that'd be great fun. Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Great. Thanks very much. So you've been with Mark Powell, and this has been Cultural Markisms. It's been fantastic to have you along this afternoon. Thanks again to Dr. Stuart Piggin, one of Australia's leading academics and intellectuals, and his work on the Fountain of Public Prosperity. the impact of evangelicalism on Australian church history, and not just church history, but history in general. It's been great to have you with us, and I look forward to seeing you next time.
Cultural Markisms is a production of The Good Source, hosted by Mark Powell. To watch, listen to, or read more content without the SJW PC fact filter, visit goodsource.news. That's good, SAUCE.news. Become a Good Source supporter for exclusive access to live and unedited interview recordings, including the conversations before and after the show.